All right, yes. Good evening, everyone. As I said, my name is Ian Watson, Senior Planner with Upland Planning and Design, and we're working with the Municipality of the District of Yarmouth for the Municipal Planning Strategy and Land Use Bylaw Review. So tonight, I'm going to go through highlights of what we have in the public draft that's out in the world now. I'll trying to balance time and interest and depth. So I'll try and hit all the high points. And then after my presentation, if there are topics that people will have questions about and want to delve into further, we can certainly do that. I'll start off with a bit of context on planning in general and where we've been so far on this project, what work's been done to date, and then, of course, the highlights. So I think without further ado, I will get going. So this project's been going on for some time now, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of the work has been going on behind the scenes to date, though there was a round of engagement that I'll talk about shortly. But a lot of that work started out with analysis, comprehensive look at where the municipality is today in terms of, its physical reality, things like slope and water courses and that kind of thing, but also looking at things like demographics. How is the population changing? How is the economy changing? And obviously the last couple of years of COVID have thrown a whole wrench in that, or a whole change the story on demographics in Atlantic Canada as a whole, and certainly within the municipality of the District of Yarmouth. To kick the project off publicly, we did a series of advertising of the project, posters, a email list, and then, of course, the project website, planmody.ca, planmody.ca. And that website is the kind of central hub for the project. You've probably been there if you signed up for this meeting, but certainly I encourage you to go there. The drafts are posted on the website, and there's opportunities on there to provide your feedback on the drafts, as well as information about upcoming opportunities to engage. So we did have I guess, a formative or initial round of engagement. And, the idea of that round of engagement was to get ideas of what matters to you as a community. What are the things that are important? What are the things that you want to see change? And what is really your vision for the future? And so through that, we had a series of pop-ups where we engaged with 81 residents. We had an online survey that had some good responses, an interactive map where people could leave comments about the municipality spatially, as well as stakeholder calls to adjacent municipalities, to NGOs, to developers, anyone who might have a specific topic specific interest in planning in the municipality. And coming out of that engagement, there were some key themes that we heard. One was environment. That was probably the top key theme. How much people in the municipality value access to nature and trails, and how there was a general sense of wanting protection for the many lakes that are in the municipality, and then making sure that we're balancing economic development and its impacts on the environment. Another, I think, to no one's surprise, key theme was housing. And certainly this isn't restricted to the municipality. This is a topic that we're hearing all over Atlantic Canada. But housing availability and affordability and suitability also, it's one thing to have housing, it's another to have housing that meets your needs and is in good shape. People highlighting challenges in finding housing that meets their needs, again, in size or location or type of housing, and particularly when it comes to the rental market. And people flagged the potential, maybe we should be looking at ways to enable conversions to create more units or adaptively reuse buildings that had been built for other purposes for housing. We heard a lot about infrastructure, things like road maintenance, alternative transportation like cycling, hiking, that kind of thing. EV charging, making sure we're preparing for the future by accommodating electrical vehicles. Looking at things like servicing extensions, sewer and water, and then renewable energy, solar and wind. We heard about the economy, again, balancing it with the environment, potentially expanding commercial development options in hamlets. Again, about services, and in this case, this was a comment on access to services like food, like grocery stores or doctors' offices, and making sure that we have those available for people who want to live in the municipality. Commenting on the importance of resource activities, fishing, forestry, agriculture to a degree. And then we really heard a pride in the community and eagerness to share it with the world. So we've been doing all that work in the background, and then through the preliminary engagement. And then since then, we've been working on a drafts of the documents to respond to what we heard. Those are now available. They're in the world, and we are in draft engagement. So letting people know that the drafts are out there, this online public meeting and in-person meeting, speaking to the neighboring municipalities, as well as checking in with the province to make sure we're meeting all their requirements. We're going to be doing this over the next month-ish or so. And then we're going to collate everything that we heard and take it back to the Planning Advisory Committee at the municipality for some direction on how do we want to respond to this feedback. We may hear that people love the direction. We may hear that there's things that we missed. And so how do we change these drafts to respond to that? And I always like to say that it's, they're capital D drafts. They're not set in stone until the day that council adopts them. And then even then, planning documents get amended in the future. But this is the time, this is the ideal time now to make sure to check in, make sure we've got it right, and adjust as necessary. So we'll produce a final draft, and then we go through a formal adoption process that is required under the Municipal Government Act. And through that process, there will be another formal public hearing where you can get up and speak to council directly before they make their final decision. So just want to give a really quick overview for planning in general in Nova Scotia for those who don't know. In Nova Scotia, we have what's called the Municipal Government Act, and I think of it as our toolbox as planners and as municipalities. It sets out the standards we have to meet and also the tools that we have to meet them. And from that toolbox, we put together a municipal planning strategy, which is our blueprint for the community. It's the high-level vision, the goals, the policies for where we want to go over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And then from these high-level policies, we develop a land use bylaw, which is, the nuts and bolts regulations. It's the standards that when you come into the municipality to open a business or build a house, those are the rules that you have to meet. It's the zoning and on all the rules that have to go with that. And the key thing is the bylaw has to agree with the plan, and the plan has to agree with the act. So how that might play out in practice is the MGA, the act, says a municipal planning strategy must contain statements of policy with respect to housing. Then through the plan, you might say something like the municipality of the district of Yarmouth values and wants to enable a diversity of housing options in the municipality. And then through the land use bylaw, the nuts and bolts, you would create a range of zones that permit different types of housing and to fulfill that policy. I also want to plan, or rather to highlight some of the things going back to that toolbox. We are, it puts a box around us a little bit in what we can and can't do with planning. So some of the things that we can specifically regulate are things like lot standards, the size, the frontage, building size and placement, uses permitted on the land. It's called a land use bylaw. Signage, outdoor storage, landscaping, sensitive environments. and a couple of other things, which covers a lot. But there are also a couple of things that come up regularly in these engagements that people bring up. And this is obviously not an exhaustive list of things we can't regulate, but it's the big ones that I hear a lot that our toolbox doesn't give us that power to do. And a big one is resource activities. So we don't regulate the act of resource extraction. So we don't regulate the act of farming, the act of fishing, the act of forestry, or the act of mining. We can regulate things related to them, like where it's appropriate to have a sawmill or not, but not the actual logging of trees, for example. We don't regulate lands below the ordinary high water mark. Then you're into provincial territory. We don't regulate people. We regulate buildings and uses, but not who uses those buildings and uses. We don't regulate motor vehicles on the road. And we don't regulate, this comes up a fair bit, trees, except in relation to development. So like blanket prohibitions on cutting trees and stuff, again, it doesn't fall within our toolbox. One other thing that I wanted to flag, because it will come up as we're going through the highlights, you'll hear these words, because they are fairly important, because they set out the process for how someone gets something approved, and that affects, how long things take, the level of public engagement, the risk, and all of those things. So we kind of have a spectrum. On the lower end of the spectrum, we have as of right development. That's the most common process you'll see. It's probably what will happen if you ever come and build a house or something like that. You check the zoning, you see if you meet it. If you do, you come in, apply, get a permit. Easy peasy, pretty quick turnaround. That's it. We have a kind of next level up, which is site plan approval. And in this case, there's additional criteria in the land use bylaw. They can be qualitative rather than hard numbers. And there's some discretion given to the development officer, that's the person who issues the permits, some discretion given to them to kind of negotiate how you meet those criteria. Surrounding property owners are notified upon approval of a site plan approval, and they can appeal it. And the result of all of this is that there's a kind of a fast to medium turnaround on the order of kind of weeks to months. And then finally, we have the development agreement. In these cases, it's a council process. It's evaluated against the policies in the municipal planning strategy. Council, that's what council uses to say yay or nay. And typically we use those for complex projects, where you might be involving sewer or water, or where it's a big, massive industrial development or something like that. Or ones that have strong public interest, where we know that we're going to want to have extensive public engagement. Development agreements allow flexibility depending on how the policy is written. It's registered to the property, so it carries with the land to future owners, but it's slow. It can take upwards of 6 months. It can take years in some municipalities, like HRM, and property owners are notified. And one last thing before we get into the meat of the documents is future land use map versus zoning. So if you read the municipal planning strategy, you'll see the future land use map. And again, that's the broad strokes of how we see our community evolving. That light yellow color there on the map is the residential designation. And that's a broad basket, basically, of saying all these lands, we kind of see them being residential in the future. Then you go to the zoning map in the land use bylaw where the regulations are, and that basket gets divvied up into more detail, specific zones. So, there's the residential general, which is I'll talk about, but it's kind of a general residential zone that allows a fair bit. But then you go to the dark brown there, and it's the mixed multi-unit residential. They're both residential, they both fit in that big basket, but they differ. And then council can consider rezonings, changes to the zoning map to jump between one residential zone to another. So that's it on the how. We have, as I mentioned, the 2 drafts. They are available on the project website. I'm going to go into those now. So in terms of broad structure, the documents Obviously, every community in the municipality has its unique uh, features, its culture, its whether it's coastal or inland. But there are, for the purposes of kind of planning, we've broken it down into three broad types of community. There's the serviced residential commercial communities. That's the Hebron and Lakes District. And then hamlets. And hamlets are communities, they might be serviced partially sewer or water. They might have sidewalks, but they're smaller, and but they act as kind of the hubs for their surrounding area. There might be a collection of commercial services or community services like halls or that kind of thing that really survive, that really supply the surrounding area or meet the needs of the surrounding area. So one of the big changes in these drafts from the current documents is the creation of two new hamlets, one in South Ohio, and then one in Carleton. And then the rest of the areas which make up the bulk of the municipality are classified as rural. And those are areas that have recreational potential, have a working landscape in terms of forestry, that are lower density and more spread out. So when it comes to residential uses in the draft and the approach to housing, there's a couple of key changes that the drafts propose. And one is accessory dwellings. So this would be backyard suites or granny flats or carriage houses or whatever you want to call them. They could be within the main dwelling or in a backyard. The drafts would permit these in all zones that permit dwellings except for the lakeside residential. Allow one per lot, and there's a cap on the size and lot coverage. So lot coverage is how much of the lot is covered by buildings. Also, in relation to residential, the drafts treat supportive housing. So that's everything from residential facilities to group homes, exactly the same as dwellings of a similar size. So, small group homes would be treated the same as a detached dwelling, and larger residential care facilities would be treated the same as a multi-unit building. A home is a home is a home. Another major change is the creation, I kind of alluded to it on that earlier map, of the multiple unit residential zone. So this zone allows higher densities of residential development. And in order to kind of enable easier development of housing in the municipality, which is something we heard was needed, we created the zone and actually pre-applied it to large areas of Dayton. So, there isn't a need in those pre-applied areas to come in to ask for a rezoning or anything like that. It would be possible, if the plan was adopted as it is today, to come in and ask for permits to build higher densities of housing in those areas. And that zone has a smaller minimum lot size compared to other zones. And then, as you see below, allows more dwellings as of right. Above those numbers, so all zones would permit all residential zones would permit 4 units as of right, except for the multiple unit at 10. And then more than that, council can consider through that development agreement process that takes some time and has public engagement and has a multitude of criteria. The way it's structured also allows group dwellings. I think the most famous example of that these days is the Treehouse Village in Bridgewater, where you have multiple dwellings on a lot and there's a central shared housing. It doesn't have to be in that structure. It could be there's seniors housing in the Annapolis Valley, for example, that takes a similar approach. It could be a condominium, could be rentals, but the drafts enable that multiple dwellings in different buildings on one lot. And there's also in the documents policy support for inclusionary zoning. So this is a relatively new tool in our toolbox that allows municipalities to straight up through the zoning require affordable housing. The challenge with it is that no one's done it yet in Nova Scotia. Everyone's kind of trying to figure out how to create the structures behind it, who's responsible for maintaining its affordability and checking that, what is affordable. So at this time, as part of this bigger project, it's maybe one thing too far in the work that needs to be done, but there's policy support in the draft plan so that when that further research is done, it's easy for council, if desired, to implement that tool. So yeah, here, for example, here's a zoom in on the Lakes District of various residential zones. So there's the general zone, and there's those big chunks of multiple unit residential. Commercial uses. So not a whole lot has changed in regards to commercial. The existing planning documents for the municipality are quite solid in this regard and are still applicable to the context today. With the conversion of Carleton to a hamlet, there is a new area of hamlet commercial zoning that's applied in the kind of core area there. Excuse me. And but otherwise the zoning is relatively the same when it comes to commercial uses. One thing that we have looked at is accommodations. This comes up a lot in regards to short-term rentals, Airbnbs, that kind of thing. So the drafts permit accommodations, and we switched to using the broad term accommodations and not differentiating between hotel, motel, bed and breakfast, short, Airbnb, all that, because the province has new accommodations regulations that do the same thing. They just lump them all into one. So accommodations are permitted as a main use in the commercial zones. So that's your hotels and all that kind of thing. And they are permitted as a home occupation in residential zones. And I'll talk about those in a second, but the effect of that is that it does permit them, but it restricts them to primary residences. And I'll go into more detail on that in a second. The other small tweak to commercial uses is that small teaching, so piano teaching, voice lessons or whatever, just out of your living room. There's a clear exemption for that kind of thing from the rules. You don't need to get a permit. No one's going to shut you down for doing small teaching at your house. So home occupations or home-based businesses, as you see them called sometimes, are currently permitted in the municipality, but we've refined that a little bit. So we're specific about the uses that are permitted as a home occupation. So that's that accommodations, assembly processing. I can't remember what that is. Building contractors, offices, small scale manufacturing, personal services, that kind of thing, retail uses. But it's limited in scope in terms of number of employees who don't live at the site, as well as the size. And that's the big one. It's a cap on size, 25% of the dwelling. And accommodations are limited to 5 sleeping units. The key thing with a home occupation is that the person who's running it has to be a resident of the site. And so to go back to that Airbnb or whatever, it does make it possible to rent out a room in your house or rent your home when you're traveling to Florida or something like that. But it restrains the scale of that. In the hamlets and rural areas, also, it's possible there's a wider range of home occupations that's permitted by site plan approval, so that higher level of scrutiny. Industrial uses. A name change of the rural industrial zone to general industrial, because we've expanded where it's used, not just to rural areas. And the business and industrial park zone has been refined. There's the Nova West Regional Industrial Park, which council's recently kind of taken a strategic look at its future and what it's going to be intended for, is more of a business park and less of an heavy industrial park. So we've reduced the range of uses permitted in that zone to better align with that vision. The big change when it comes to industrial is a new general industrial zone along Hard Scratch Road from the town boundary to the dairy bar, and I'll show that map in a second. Also, there's a permission for accessory residential in the industrial zones, and this is primarily to accommodate staff housing, which some businesses have been asking for. So this is the new Hard Scratch Road. This is the road here. There's the Highway 103. This is the town of Yarmouth boundary. So there's this new general industrial area that's proposed that extends. This is in the red is the dairy bar. So certainly we're looking for people's feedback on that as part of the engagement on whether that's boundaries right or whether that makes sense. Obviously, that's a major change for the area. Environment, as we heard, engagement. This is a massive topic for people. So one of the key things is coastal development. Obviously, it's a sea level rise, more intense storms, and how are we responding to that in terms of our development. Nova Scotia has a new Coastal Protection Act. Well, it's not that new anymore, a couple of years old. There are no regulations enforcing it yet. However, they are expected shortly. So given how close that is and not wanting to double up on regulations, the draft documents defer to the Coastal Protection Act. And once that's in place, there will be a consistent approach to regulation along the coast around the province. The current planning documents have a 12-meter watercourse buffer, distance between watercourses and development that's being maintained in most cases and expanded in one, which is the lakeside residential zone. So as I mentioned, we heard a lot about the lakes and wanting to protect those. So a major change in these documents is a new lakeside residential zone that we've applied to a distance of about 200 meters around most lakes. In that zone, the watercourse buffer is increased to 15 meters. There is a minimum lot size of 5,000 square meters. Bigger lots mean less area total around a lake needs to be cleared for things like septic and that sort of thing. The zone is more restrictive in the uses it permits than other rural zones. And residential development in this zone is by site plan approval or development agreement if you're doing large residential like a resort type development. Through that process, we expect applicants to look at species at risk habitat and make sure they're not impacting that, and to also provide a stormwater management plan so that runoff is being considered and its potential effect on the lakes. Also, more broadly on the environment topic, all applications for site that go via site plan approval would require a stormwater management plan. And there in the dark green, you can see that lake residential zone throughout the municipality is proposed. There are some exceptions. Lake George, for example, is the watershed and it has other protective zoning. But yeah. Also on the environmental topic, as I mentioned, accommodating electrical vehicle charging. So allowing it accessory, to another use, allowing that everywhere. And then commercial style, like an EV gas station, for lack of a better term, would be dependent on the zoning. So commercial zones would allow that type of thing, or industrial zones. Solar collectors, allowing that as an accessory use. Again, I've been using this term accessory. That's basically secondary to something else on the property. So an accessory solar collector would be, for example, me putting them on my roof at my house, secondary to the home. So allowing that everywhere clearly and giving clear permission, but also allowing solar collectors as a main use where they would be the purpose of how that land is used in industrial zones, the airport zone, rural zoning, and hamlet commercial. Wind turbines, micro scale turbines, kind of on the kilowatt scale, that would be permitted everywhere as an accessory use. Small scale wind under 10 kilowatts permitted in hamlets, rural and industrial zones, and then large wind bigger than 10 kilowatts through that development agreement process where there would be public engagement and thorough review in the rural development zone. What was previously called, or what is currently called, the coastal wetland zone in the current planning documents has been renamed to sensitive environment zone because we've expanded how it's used. It's not just on coastal wetlands. It's also on inland wetlands in some cases, and other sensitive environments. And through this process, Alex, the municipality's mapping technician or GIS technician, did a lot of really good work working with new development from new data, from the province, to update the boundary of that zone to be more accurate. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. The draft documents also recognize the dark skies in the municipality and how special those are, and the fact that the municipality has been recognized internationally for that. And the criteria that council uses for example, evaluating development agreements actually requires that consideration of potential impact on dark skies. The municipality currently has a dikeland zone that protects the dikelands. That is continued, and similarly, there's a floodplain zone around the river whose name escapes me at the moment, just outside the town of Yarmouth, and that is also continued. So here's an example of that coastal wetland / sensitive environment zone. On the left is the existing planning documents, and as you can see, if you look closely, this area here, it's actually over this island, and on the right is the more based on more accurate data, and you can see how it's been corrected to actually follow where that coastal wetland actually is or isn't. Servicing sewer and water. These are important municipal investments. They are valuable to our communities, but they're also expensive and require a lot of maintenance. So the drafts require connections to sewers where they're available. If we have them, we want to use them. There's also explicit policy for extensions, so that council has something to guide them when there are requests for servicing extensions. Primarily looking to make sure there's a clear benefit to the community at large, not just the landowner who's requesting such an extension. And then in doing that, and then in doing that consideration, when council's looking at that, thinking about what is the cost of that and the overall recovery for the municipality for financial sustainability. Transportation and parking. One of the related kind of to services is our roads. Municipalities in Nova Scotia, since 1995, when a new subdivision is built, the road becomes the property of the municipality, and the responsibility and the liability to the municipality in terms of maintenance and replacement. So we want to be strategic about roads. So in the service residential areas and the service commercial areas, where we're centralized, it makes sense to have public roads instead of private roads, and so new development in those areas would only be permitted on public roads or existing private roads. We reviewed the minimum parking requirements, making sure that they aren't overkill. It's easy to require too much parking. Parking is important, but it's easy to require too much parking and have that be a burden on property owners, on developers, and ultimately on the people who use those buildings in terms of passed on costs, and on the community at large in terms of how much space we dedicate in our communities. So we reviewed the parking requirements and lowered them where appropriate. We also implemented through the draft bicycle parking incentive, basically. Not a requirement for it, but if you want to provide bicycle parking, the drafts allow you to provide a couple fewer automobile parking spaces as kind of an incentive. And one of the other key documents that we're not reviewing as part of this, because it was done recently in the municipality, is the subdivision bylaw. It controls the subdivision of land, and particularly the construction of infrastructure, sewer, water, and sidewalks, roads. So there is policy support in the drafts for future subdivision bylaw amendments to require sidewalks and active transportation connections. So next time that comes up for review, council will have that policy support. The rural and resource type uses. So the Municipal Government Act, that toolbox, requires us to identify agricultural soils and provide them protections where appropriate. So the municipal planning strategy now has a soils map. District of Yarmouth, Municipality District of Yarmouth, certainly has its share of agriculture, but isn't a major agricultural center in the grand scheme of the Nova Scotia context. So we didn't see a particular need to, have stringent protection per se, but agriculture and other resource-based uses are broadly permitted in hamlet and rural areas. When they get a little more intensive livestock farms, fur farms, and fish reduction, the drafts would only consider those by development agreement. Again, that more stringent process. There's now an exemption for small scale farm, fish, and forestry stalls. You don't need a permit, or you wouldn't need a permit through the drafts for small stalls. That's the selling eggs or garden produce at the end of your driveway kind of thing. There's broad exemption for outdoor storage of fishing gear and equipment. Obviously, this is really important in the municipality. We don't want planning to get in the way of that. And then clear permission for household livestock uses. So that's you're keeping your small amount of livestock in serviced hamlet and rural areas, except for the lakeside zone, on lots larger than 4,000 square meters. And since this might come up, these documents don't regulate the number of animals like some municipalities do. What this regulates is the size of buildings for those animals. So there are, through that definition of household livestock, restrictions on the size of the building that would house them. From a heritage and culture perspective, there's incentives through the proposed drafts for people who have registered heritage properties. Obviously, these are important to the wider community. Often they're a point of pride, but also their extra upkeep and maintenance and cost. So there are some incentives to do that upkeep and cost. They're exempt from parking requirements. We wouldn't want to have someone tear down a heritage building because they couldn't accommodate enough parking that the bylaw required of them. It allows extra accommodations units, boarding house units, and extra home occupation employees if you have a registered heritage building. And also there's a policy in there that allows consideration for unique uses in a heritage property. If you buy, the one I think of is in Kentville, where the old United Church was turned into a wonderful library. In that case, there's a policy there that would allow those kind of unique adaptations of heritage buildings for things that wouldn't otherwise be permitted in the zone. The zoning widely permits cultural uses as appropriate to the type of zone. And similar to the heritage reuse policy, there is also a policy for adaptive reuse of institutional buildings. So that might be your old schools, your old churches, whatever it may be. Again, allowing council to consider creative futures for those buildings to make sure that at least the building continues to be a part of the community. The current planning documents have a light station heritage zone, which applies to the Cape Verschoe Lighthouse area. That is continuing. From a Parks and Recs perspective, parks and playgrounds are permitted in almost all zones. We want to encourage them. We don't want to put barriers up for new parks and playgrounds. Similarly with trails. RVs is a topic that comes up fairly often, and limits on RVs, and they get complicated because they are both a vehicle, they are a motor vehicle, they can be moved, but they also get used as buildings, and they're very popular and important to a lot of people. So the approach that we've taken to allow some oversight of RVs, but also not to get too complex, is that any more than 2 RVs on a lot is considered an RV park, as defined in the land use bylaw. So at that point, you need to meet the zoning for where a RV park would be allowed. Below that, if it's 1 or 2, then you don't meet that definition, and your vehicle and it's not getting regulated by the land use bylaw. The recreation zone, which specifically promotes recreation uses, is permitted in all designations. So go back to that basket analogy on the future land use map. That zone can go anywhere except for the airport designation. And there's policy support for parkland dedication. So when subdivision of land happens, that parkland is given to the municipality. And a couple other key things that maybe don't fit neatly into any other category, but and people often ask about. So one is aquaculture, water-based aquaculture. So offshore is outside municipal jurisdiction. You're below that high water mark, and you're into provincial or federal territory. But the municipalities do have the ability to regulate land-based aquaculture. So that might be your fully enclosed systems, or perhaps a partially enclosed system that circulates water from the ocean onto land. Your pens on land, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And so the drafts address that by allowing land-based aquaculture by DA development agreement. That's that more comprehensive process that involves public engagement, allowing consideration of them in industrial zones by the development agreement process. And through that, there's specific policy that requires a stormwater management plan, a clear site plan that shows where, what is the plan for this area, and then requiring proponents to provide detailed information on the particulars of the system. Is it a full recirculating system? Is an open loop system? Making sure that the applications include all that information, so everybody, is on the same page. And shipping containers. This is coming up more and more. The documents treat them as a building. If you meet building code, if you insulate them properly, and everything you have to do to make them code compliant, then it's a building. From a storage perspective, there's limits on how total length in hamlets and rural zones, up to 40 feet, and not permitting them in service zones as for storage long term. You can use them temporarily, like if you're moving or whatever. And then unlimited, of course, in industrial zones where they're actually being used for shipping. Most of these things are fairly on the process side, but the drafts allow a rezoning to zones permitted in adjacent designations. They expand the list of variances that council can consider. So that's a case of where there's a site-specific hardship. You have a really weird shaped lot or something like that, that the rules don't really make sense. You can request a variance. So there's expanded flexibility there for those unique situations. Let me see here. Oh, the one that's probably of interest is notification. So we've tweaked the rules for notification for things like site or for development agreements and rezonings and other amendments. So it'd be everybody within 500 meters in the rural designation, 300 meters elsewhere. And then if it's on a lake, often because what happens on a lake affects everybody on it, all properties fronting on that lake would get notified. So that is, went a little over time there, a lot to get through, but that is the highlights of the draft. As I mentioned, they're on the website, www.planmodi.ca. There's also a feedback form on the website, as well as the background information, the background analysis, the what we heard report from the initial phase of engagement. And I also invite you, or if there's someone who would have found tonight interesting and you want to encourage them to come out, we will be having an in-person open house on April 18th at the Brooklyn Community Hall. So I encourage you to do that. So I've talked for long enough. You're probably sick of my voice.